in this library where I have spent quite a bit of time, quite a few hours over the last few years, and have really benefited from its programs for myself and for my daughter. And thank you to Jennifer for organizing this. So it's simply not possible to summarize a book in one session, so that's not my goal today. Rather, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you why I decided to write a book about the law's role in sort of shaping our desires and the law's role in interracial intimacy. I will also briefly describe my research findings and the challenges that I faced as I undertook this project. And finally, I will share my goals in writing the book, what it is that I hope that readers and others who engage with the book will take away and hopefully use as a starting point for conversations and actions in the pursuit of equality. So why did I decide to write this book? As people who know me know, I'm a law professor at Seton Hall Law School, where I've been for 24 years. And most of my writing over the last 24 years or so really is focused on children's relationships with adults, with parental figures. I usually do not write about relationships between adults. However, about a decade ago, I noticed that my family members and about half of my family members and many of my spouse's family members, my spouse and I are both Latino, were in committed relationships with white, non-Latino partners, but none had African American partners. And I thought that was a little puzzling because my spouse and I and our family members were all raised in predominantly Black or Latino neighborhoods, either in New York City, or in New Jersey, predominantly in Newark. And so really in minority Black and Latino neighborhoods. And we attended schools, really segregated schools, what scholars have referred to as apartheid schools, which were predominantly African American or Latino. And we didn't have any white neighbors or any white classmates, and really didn't know anyone who was white except for our school teachers until we went to college. We didn't have any white friends until we went to college. So I was just curious, and I started casually asking my family members who were in relationships with white partners about what attracted them to their partners. And I also asked them how they had identified in the census, how they had answered the race question, and how those who had children had answered the race question for their children. And what was really interesting is that quite a few of them said that they had selected the box for white. And I thought that was really odd because most of them looked something in terms of phenotype, skin color, they look like me, clearly not Caucasian. And even a greater number had identified their children, their multiracial children, as white. And so I was a little bit disturbed because to me it suggested a type of racial passing, a desire to be white, or at the very least, a rejection of a mixed racial background or a brown identity. But I understood it. And the reason I understood it is because Latinos are taught from a very early age that light skin tone and proximity to whiteness is preferable to darker skin and proximity to blackness. Anti-black bias is very common in the Latino community. In fact, Latino parents, grandparents teach their children, either expressly or implicitly, from a very early age about the need to mejorar la raza. That translates literally into improving the race. And how do you do that? How do you improve the race? It's by marrying and having children with lighter complexion individuals, preferably Caucasian individuals. So my conversations with family members really led me to conclude that many had sort of internalized the message that white partners are preferable to partners of other races. But I wanted to see how widespread these preferences might be. Was it just our family, or was something broader going on in society? So I began looking at the work of social scientists who were exploring individuals' preferences in the dating market, both online and offline. And I discovered that it wasn't just my family and my spouse's family who preferred white partners, but that this preference is actually very, very common among only age and gender were more important than race. Religion, not as important. Whether someone was married to someone else, not as important. Whether someone was a smoker, not as important. But race was third on the list, at least when we're looking at online dating sort of preferences. So let me share some statistics. So studies have repeatedly shown, have repeatedly found that people on dating apps, regardless of their own race, and so this means whites, African Americans, Latinos, Asian, are more likely to contact white users on online dating apps and to respond to messages from white daters than they are to respond to messages from other groups. They are also the least likely to contact. They're least likely to contact and least likely to respond to messages from African American women and from Asian American men. So those are the two groups that are at the very bottom of the hierarchy. So we see these preferences not only in individuals who are seeking partners of the opposite sex, so heterosexual individuals, but also among men who are seeking male partners, so among gay men. Researchers have found that the same racial hierarchy that exists in the heterosexual dating market also exists in the gay male dating market. Specifically, Asian American and African American men are at the bottom of the hierarchy in the gay dating market. Gay men of all races prefer whites and lighter complexion Latinos over Asian Americans or African American partners. Now, interestingly, lesbian women who are seeking same-sex partners, were least influenced by race. I mean, but scholars haven't figured out why, but lesbian women are the most egalitarian. So now these racial preferences are reflected in the data on interracial marriage, right? Now marriage is a function of both racial preferences and opportunity, obviously. But in 2019, 19% of new marriages were between persons of different races or between Latinos and non-Latinos. And I'm going to talk about Latinos and how they fit into our conversations about race in a moment. But studies have found that if individuals across the U.S. were matched randomly without regard to race, but after taking into account geography, religion, socioeconomic status, education, factors that help us figure out, who's going to pick who. It turns out that approximately 44% of marriages would be interracial, or between Latinos and non-Latinos. So 19% versus 44%. So before I share more statistics and discuss the role of the law in interracial intimacy, I think it's important to explain how I'm defining certain key terms. First, I think it's important in this day and age to explain why I'm using the gender term Latino, which people think of as male, instead of the more modern gender-neutral Latinx, Latina, or Hispanic. Now, although I personally would prefer a gender-neutral term, the reality is that most Latinos outside of academic circles reject the term Latinx or Latina, don't really know what that is. Most prefer to be described as Hispanic or Latino. But I reject Hispanic because it does not reflect our roots in Latin American roots or Latin American origins, and does not really reflect sort of our multiracial backgrounds. So I use the term Latino, even though it's gender, because it does honor our multiracial Latin American origins, and because it is a term that is preferred by a significant percentage of the Latino population. But I want to make clear that when I use Latino, I'm using it in the same way that people who are speaking Spanish use it to mean male, female, and also individuals who identify as non-binary. But when I'm referring to Latino women alone, I use the term Latina. Second, I think it's important to explain why researchers treat intimate relationships between Latinos and non-Latinos as interracial relationships in the same way that they treat relationships between different racial groups, even though, according to the U.S. Census, Latinos are not a racial group, but rather are an ethnic group. Some Latinos are light complexion and appear phenotypically white, others appear phenotypically black. Many Latinos have significant indigenous ancestry, and many of us trace our ancestry to 3 or more races. But although the U.S. defines Latino as an ethnic category and not a racial category, when social scientists and policymakers are comparing rates of marriage, poverty, wealth, education, fertility, health outcomes, you name it, between racial groups, they put Latinos in there and they treat Latinos as a racial group. And so when examining racial preferences in the dating and marriage market, I rely on the work of social scientists who treat Latinos as a distinct group similar to Asian Americans, African Americans, and whites. And I think this makes sense for two additional reasons. First, over 40% of Latinos actually identify their race as Latino and reject the racial categories provided by the census. I know that in my family, this has always been a challenge. What box do we check? Because the boxes are white, black, Asian, Pacific Islander, or American Indian. And for Latinos, well, none of those boxes fits quite right for many Latinos. Second, Latinos have been and continue to be racialized as non-white. Even though Mexican Americans, the largest Latino group in the U.S., were for decades legally categorized as white as a result of a treaty with Mexico, an 1898 treaty with Mexico, the majority of Americans have never treated Latinos or even Mexican Americans as white. During the Jim Crow era in the South, before the law prohibited racial discrimination and segregation, Mexican Americans were denied access to schools where white children attended. They were subject to racially motivated violence, including lynching, and they were also denied access to public accommodations like public swimming pools, or denied access to restaurants or even public bathrooms. So they were treated in the same way that African Americans were treated in the South. And even today, we know that Latinos are targets of racially motivated discrimination and violence. So for these reasons, I treat, when examining racial preferences, I do treat Latinos and look at the data that I really value the data that treats Latinos as a racial group. All right, so back to rates of interracial marriage. The actual rate of interracial marriage of 19% as compared to 44%, which is what would happen if race didn't matter, really suggests that race continues to influence our intimate choices. But the extent to which race affects our intimate choices really depends on the intersection of an individual's race and gender identity. So today, more than 1/3 of second-generation Asian American and Latinos, meaning those who were born in the United States to immigrant parents, marry a person of a different race. So, pretty high numbers. But in contrast, only 18% of African Americans marry someone who is not African American. The contrast is even starker when one considers gender. Asian American women are more than 3 times as likely as African American women to marry someone of a different race. And we see the same racial patterns among same-sex couples. Although same-sex couples are more likely than different-sex couples to be in interracial marriage, however, the patterns are still the same. Meaning, just to give you an example, that Asian Americans and Latinos in same-sex relationships are significantly more likely to have a white partner than African Americans. So 67% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and 55% of Latinos who identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual are in a relationship with a white partner, as compared to only about 1/3 of African Americans. So now I want to talk about the role of law, because while I thought this was all really interesting, I'm a lawyer, and my goal or my interest was in exploring if and how the law has influenced and continues to influence our racialized romantic preferences. So specifically, I wanted to explore why some groups have much higher rates of interracial intimacy, and how the law's discriminatory treatment of different groups, the racial hierarchy that the law basically followed until the 1960s, shaped and continues to shape our preferences and opportunities to enter into intimate relationships with partners of different races. And so along with segregation, legally sanctioned segregation in housing and in schools, and discriminatory immigration and naturalization laws, along with current policies and practices, including exclusionary zoning, the K through 12 public assignment system, and spatial segregation, all work together to shape our romantic preferences. So I'm going to briefly discuss each of these, and then I'm also going to address the role of technology and how all of these perpetuate inequality in our society today. So let's start with anti-miscegenation laws. These state laws, which as I mentioned, prohibited whites from marrying African Americans, but did not prohibit minority groups, so African Americans from marrying other minority groups, or Latinos from marrying any groups of color, and did not restrict Asian Americans from marrying, let's say, Native Americans. It really only applied to whites marrying African Americans, and also to whites marrying certain other groups as well in some jurisdictions. But these laws were in effect in 41 states. 41. New Jersey was not one of them. So New Jersey actually never had anti-miscegenation laws. But these laws were in effect in 41 states, starting in 1664 all the way up to 1967. And as I said, these laws were in effect until 1967 in many states, until the Supreme Court, in a case aptly named Loving versus Virginia, held that these laws promoted white supremacy and violated the U.S. Constitution's guarantee of equal protection under the law. However, although these laws were struck down in 1967 is not that long ago. And let's not forget that for 300 years, the law explicitly and implicitly conveyed that the groups that whites were prohibited from marrying, as I said, in all 41 states, whites were prohibited from marrying African Americans, and in about 15 states, whites were also prohibited from marrying Asian Americans, and in about 7 states, they were prohibited from marrying Native Americans. But these laws, these anti-miscegenation laws, signaled that the groups that whites were prohibited from marrying were actually inferior to whites. And generations of Americans internalized these messages and then passed them down to their children and grandchildren even after these laws were struck down. I've been surprised, teaching students in 2020, 2022, who have said to me they grew up in New Jersey, that they always got a sense that their parents really felt that it would be inappropriate for them to have a relationship with someone of a different race, primarily or specifically the person was African American, and that they got this message that these groups were not the same as they in terms of work ethic and etc. So those were the state laws. Now, federal laws conveyed a similar message of white supremacy. Beginning in 1882, Congress passed numerous laws banning persons from Asia and from Latin America from immigrating to the U.S. So, for example, the Immigration Act of 1924, which was actually the broadest of these laws, excluded any person ineligible for citizenship from entry into the U.S. Well, at the time, only whites and persons of African ancestry were eligible to become U.S. citizens. Moreover, in the 2 years prior to the enactment of this 1924 law, the Supreme Court held in 2 separate decisions that persons of Asian ancestry, Southeast Asians and Asians, East Asians, were not white. Thus, the law completely barred individuals of Asian ancestry from immigrating to the United States. I mean, the one exception, I should say, was Filipinos because of the U.S. Relationship with the Philippines. Another federal law prohibited and provided that American women who married men who were ineligible for U.S. citizenship forfeited their own U.S. citizenship. So, since Asians could not become naturalized U.S. citizens, this law strongly discouraged American women from marrying Asian men. The 1924 law did not exclude Mexicans. It couldn't, because as I noted, Mexicans were legally white However, although the 1924 law could not expressly exclude Mexicans, Congress in just a few years later enacted the Border Patrol specifically to exclude immigrants from Mexico. So it passed this law known as this is the actual name of the statute, Undesirable Aliens Act. And it prohibited entry into the U.S. outside an official court and made it a felony to re-enter illegally after being deported. If you look at the legislative history, the congressional record, the Undesirable Aliens Act was driven by, and this is a quote from the legislative history, fear of racial mixture between white women and inferior races, specifically race mixing between whites and Mexicans. The Undesirable Alien Act's legislative history is replete with examples demonstrating that lawmakers felt that the U.S. had to restrict immigration from Latin America because, this is again a quote from the legislative history, blood from a person from Latin America is a very great penalty upon the society which assimilates it because it is composed of mixture blood of white, Indian, and Negro. And as one federal court held recently, recognized recently, the Undesirable Aliens Act solidified perceptions of persons from Latin America as a separate, unwelcome race. So, while no federal laws expressly prohibited interracial intimacy, federal immigration and naturalization laws did hinder and certainly did discourage these types of relationships. So now I want to talk about segregation in housing and in schools. Until the 1960s, federal, state, and local governments promoted and enforced discriminatory housing policies such as redlining and racially restricted covenants that kept African Americans and other racial minorities out of white neighborhoods and out of schools with predominantly white students. This is all documented in Richard Rothstein's 2018 book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And he has examples from Fanwood and, a lot of New Jersey is included in there. So preventing interracial intimacy was actually a driving force behind segregation. In fact, lawmakers expressly defended residential segregation on this ground. Lawmakers feared that if white and non-white individuals lived near each other, went to school together, and shared public spaces, that they would develop friendships and eventually they would develop intimate relationships. While so much of the discussion of segregation in schools has focused on the South, on African American children in the South, states across the United States, including New York and California, assigned Native American, Asian, and Latino children to segregated schools. Lawmakers and school officials agreed with white parents who feared that if white children went to school with Black, Latino, Asian, and Native American children, that white children would no longer view children of non-white children as inferior, and that they would become friends, later on they would date and possibly get married and have mixed-race children. The Mississippi Supreme Court's decision in Rice versus Gong illustrates lawmakers' concerns that integrated schools would lead to interracial intimacy and what they refer to as amalgamation. In this case, a 9-year-old girl of Chinese descent was denied access to her local school. The school was down on the corner. Was denied access to her local school because that school was for white children only. So her father brought an action, sued the school district, arguing that the law violated her rights under the U.S. Constitution to equal treatment. And the Supreme Court of Mississippi disagreed. The court looked at its state constitution, which required separate schools for white and, quote, colored children, and also the Constitution prohibited marriages between whites and members of the Asian race. And the court explained that the purpose of both provisions together was to preserve, and I'm going to read a quote here, the integrity and purity of the white race. And the court held that, again another quote, taking all of the provisions of the law together, it is manifest that it is the policy of this state to have and maintain separate schools and other places of association for the races so as to prevent race amalgamation. End quote. So I've been talking about the past and and which limit opportunities for interracial relationships. So, but first I think it's important to acknowledge that the past isn't completely in the past. For example, while racial segregation is now illegal, little has actually changed in terms of the composition of our neighborhoods. As price of housing has skyrocketed and racial minorities who attended under-resourced schools and who as a result of racial segregation were deprived of opportunities to buy property in certain neighborhoods, have not had the same opportunities to accumulate wealth and to acquire property in neighborhoods like Westfield, for example. Many public schools today are as segregated as they were in the 1970s. And white children often grow up in white neighborhoods and go to school with mainly white students and have very limited opportunities to interact with children of other racial backgrounds. And just to give you an example, our public schools here in Westfield are less than 3% African American. That's a result of, part of it is our history, but part of it is our current policies. One of those policies is exclusionary zoning, and we have an expert on zoning here, Professor Angela Carmela. Our segregated neighborhoods are facilitated by exclusionary zoning, laws that allow only single-family homes to be built in certain areas. Given the racial wealth gap, single-family home ownership is out of reach for many racial minorities, specifically or primarily African American and Latinos. So these laws keep them out of predominantly white neighborhoods and white suburbs. Another policy that serves to keep racial minorities out of predominantly white neighborhoods is the Mrs. Murphy exception. Federal law and the law and state laws in most states prohibit landlords from discriminating when renting out units to tenants. However, there's an exception, the Mrs. Murphy exception, which allows the owner of multi-family dwellings with 4 or fewer units, I mean the number is actually lower in New Jersey, but the federal law allows owners of multi-family dwellings with 4 or fewer units to discriminate when seeking a tenant so long as the owner lives in the building or in that 4-family home. The Mrs. Murphy exception signals that a property owner should not have to live in close proximity to individuals of races that she doesn't like. This exception not only signals that discrimination is acceptable in certain cases, but it also keeps racial minorities out of predominantly white neighborhoods. The school assignment system in the majority of municipalities assigns K-12 students to their local public schools, right, neighborhood schools. But these schools, because our neighborhoods are so segregated, also reflect the population of our neighborhoods. And so this system, the K-12 public school assignment system, perpetuates educational segregation and largely determines with whom children and adolescents will attend school, whom they will play with, and who they will date. And there's actually a lawsuit in the state of New Jersey, which has been ongoing since 2018, brought by the Latino Action Network and also civil rights lawyer Larry Lusberg, which is actually arguing that the state of New Jersey is in violation of the New Jersey State Constitution, which guarantees children to a free and adequate education. And that lawsuit argues that by maintaining the K-12 public school assignment system, that New Jersey continues to segregate our students. And so we'll see where that, it's been going on for quite a while, and mediation actually failed after a year, and now they're back in the courts. But the public school, the K-12 public school assignment system, not only perpetuates segregation, but it also perpetuates the achievement gap and limits access to higher education, which contributes to the racial stratification that we see in many workplaces today, and which of course limits opportunities for racial friendships, interracial friendships, and romantic relationships. The segregated K-12 schools also create psychological distance between racial groups, such that when students go to college and meet students of other racial backgrounds, they report feeling awkward and actually experiencing anxiety around students of other races because they just haven't been exposed to people of other races. This racial anxiety hinders the development of interracial friendships and romantic relationships. And finally, places where people eat, where they shop, where they exercise, often have a racial identity, right? You walk through a neighborhood and we know this is a white neighborhood or this is a black neighborhood. As a result, when racial minorities attempt to enter white spaces, they are sometimes harassed by individuals, even if it's simple, the looks, like you don't belong here, or they may actually be harassed by police officers who believe that they don't belong there. They're penalized for driving, walking, or jogging while being black or brown. Think about Arbery in Georgia, or Trayvon Martin in Florida, or the police stops of racial minorities driving in white neighborhoods. My colleague at Seton Hall Law School, where I teach, did a study and a report of racial minorities who were stopped disproportionately by police officers while driving through predominantly white suburbs of New Jersey. But it's not just harassment that's problematic and that contributes to spatial segregation. It's also the failure of the law, and at times its refusal to make certain areas, certain neighborhoods, certain spaces accessible to racial minorities whom lawmakers know rely disproportionately on public transportation. So, for example, lawmakers have rejected proposals to expand public transportation that would allow racial minorities without access to cars, to be able to access white neighborhoods. Constituents in wealthy white suburbs in Atlanta, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., for example, have opposed placing transit stops, bus stops, or train stops in their neighborhoods because they would otherwise allow low-income racial minorities to access those spaces. So spatial segregation limits opportunities for interracial interactions and intimate relationships. It creates physical barriers, but it also creates a psychological distance because it signals to racial minorities who venture into these spaces that they don't belong and that they should avoid these spaces. So now I just want to talk briefly about dating apps. So far, I've focused on how the law hinders opportunities to meet people in the offline world. But to anyone who's dated recently, the most common way to meet a romantic partner these days is online, a dating app. I mean, that's where everyone under 35 seems to be meeting someone. But our limited opportunities to meet people of different races offline actually influence who we are interested in meeting online. The internet has no geographical boundaries, but it does have psychological boundaries, right? So our psychological boundaries from the real world follow us to the online world. And so online, when people go on these dating apps, they tend to seek out romantic partners who are familiar to them. They don't seek out or respond to messages from individuals who they have been taught to see as different and as undesirable intimate partners. So as I noted, studies have found that people on dating apps tend, regardless of their race, are more likely to respond to whites and to contact white users. But dating platforms are not simply these passive platforms that accept whatever preferences individuals might have, but actually dating platforms have helped to shape and facilitated our racial preferences online. So until recently, about 75% of the most popular dating platforms, including OkCupid, Match, Hinge, for example, provided filters that allowed users to categorically exclude daters based on race. So you could just basically check the box that would exclude different groups. Not going to look at Asian Americans, I'm not going to look at African Americans, I'm not going to look at these particular groups. Now, although some of those apps have removed these filters recently, in post-2020, specifically after the murder of George Floyd, other apps still have these filters. And even those that have eliminated the filters, the algorithms on the dating apps only show you daters that they believe that you're going to be interested in. And so if you've been swiping right, meaning that yes, you want people you say yes to these people, and if you've been swiping right on whites and swiping left, meaning no, on Asian Americans, then the algorithm's only going to show you white daters. So it sort of just perpetuates itself. So dating apps not only facilitate discrimination, but they signal that racism is acceptable and even desirable. So how do racial preferences perpetuate inequality in our society? Attraction is complicated, and people have all types of preferences when they're seeking an intimate partner. Education, class, religion, height, weight, exercise enthusiast, couch potato, movie lover, So you might be asking why race is different. Why should we be concerned about racial preferences in the dating market, and why should the law take action to remove some of those barriers to interracial intimacy? So I think there's several reasons in my view. First, our racial preferences reinforce racial hierarchy and inequality in our society. Long-term romantic partnerships, committed partnerships, provide psychological, financial, and social benefits. But racial preferences limit a person's opportunities for romantic relationships and the benefits that flow therefrom for themselves, and for their children. Specifically, racial preferences limit the pool of available partners that are available to certain groups. So just to give you an example, as a result of mass incarceration and limited educational and employment opportunities for Black men, the pool of eligible, African American men, is significantly smaller than the number of African American women seeking committed relationships. Now, some scholars have suggested that given the small pool of eligible African American men, that African American women should seek who are interested in male romantic partners, that they should date men of other races